Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall, speaking from Washington, D.C., from the Georgetown University Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I'm here with Professor Alberto Melloni, who is in Bologna, Italy. I presume that's where he is. And he's a full professor of the history of Christianity at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in religious studies. And he's also the holder of the UNESCO chair on religious pluralism in Bologna. Perhaps more immediately significant, he and I are working together on the event starting in Bologna on September 12th, which is the religious engagement group for the G20 meeting. And he is the master and the architect of that meeting. But our purpose today is different. But first, let me just quickly give you the usual housekeeping details. The meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Berkeley Center website, as well as on some other. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and you are most welcome, encouraged to put any questions. We will address as many as we can during this meeting, but then we'll also look at them and incorporate them into our reflections. Because this is the kickoff event in many ways in an effort at the Berkeley Center to think about the role of religion in global affairs or in global governance. In many ways, there are three markers that have catapulted us into new thinking, looking at new portals of the roles that religious ideas, theology, practice, operations play in global affairs. So the first clearly is the events of September 11th, 2001. We're approaching the 20th anniversary, so there's a considerable reflection about it. There was also the United Nations effort at the turn of the century, at the millennium, to define global agendas, which took the form of a declaration, but also the Millennium Development Goals, succeeded in 2015 by the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, the more recent developments of extremism, religious extremism and conflict around it with Daesh, and most immediately with the shift, the change in government, shall we say, in Afghanistan, which also will catapult some new thinking. So the order for today is that Professor Melloni and I will have some exchanges and he will basically set out some of his ideas, some of his experience, and some of, I think, his challenges to all of us. And I encourage him and welcome him, of course, to kick off the discussion about framing how he sees these religious dimensions of global governance. He's a historian, so he may want to look at this in history, the present challenges, and perhaps even with a crystal ball looking forward. So, Alberto.
Thank you very much. In 1993, I had the fortune to gather a conference in Rome on otherness. The speakers were the young Alberto Melloni, of course, the young David Rosen, and even the young Bernard Lewis taking the floor in this event. When we try to discuss about what scientific research and historical research may bring to an issue that in that moment, in the beginning of the 90s, was more mature, that after Vatican II, at least on the Catholic and Christian side, but in this moment even not so strong in focusing the issue was supposed to take. Many of the ideas were still the ideas of the 30s. In 1931, Pius XI suggested a great alliance for all of those who believe at least in God, with the idea that interreligious dialogue was a way to defend and protect a Christianity, or at least faith in front of Soviet communism. In 1936, la Semaine Sociale des Catholiques in Paris gathered with a title that was the same that the famous title of Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations. And these ideas of the 30s at the beginning of the 90s were still surviving and going around. Since then, and thanks to a certain number of researchers that we have carried out in our research center, the Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna, we had some hypotheses that not became certitude, but became more strong hypotheses for work. The first is that interreligious dialogue since the 90s, since the Assisi event, if you want to take a symbolic event in 1986, interreligious dialogue has repeated always the first mile. And as you know, in the gospel, there is a monitum of Jesus saying that if somebody forces you to walk for 1 mile, make with him the second one. And so interreligious dialogue had the sense that religions were imposing the one to the other to make the first mile of dialogue, and then they returned to the starting point to repeat the same first mile. The second mile was not started, and it is not started. The first mile is very important, and it is at the same time very easy. It is important because it says that violence has no legitimation from a theological point of view, but it's also very easy because it usually ends with kisses and candles among religious leaders, usually in front of the camera. When the camera is off, they are less kind and less fervorous. The second aspect that is coming more and more evident in the past 50 years is that one of the easy prophecies of the 60s was wrong. The most important prophet of the prophecies was John Lennon. The idea that the imaginary world in which everything was right was a world with no religion too. And actually what we have seen since then is that religion are not disappearing, but on the contrary, they are affected by a sort of global warming, if we can take a metaphor from the climate change. The religious climate change is pushing more and more communities, groups, small groups in the communities to say and to experience the fact that the temperature of religious experience must grow, and they increase the temperature of religious experience. Sometimes it is so hot that it becomes violent, and it is so violent that they are capable to project on an entire immense community the suspect and the blame for the behaviors. These two aspects, in my view, are to be taken into consideration if you want to understand what Charles Taylor called the post-secular society, because yes, it is true that we are post-something, but we are also in the middle of something that has its own consistency and constituency. In a moment in which religions are challenging and challenging. In this sense, there is a double movement that we can consider in the global scene, and I will describe it very roughly, but we can go much more in detail with Catherine, with you in the next moments. One is the idea that what is happening is, as Gilles Kepel called it, la revanche de Dieu, the revenge of God. God expelled by secularization is returning. And so in this return of God, there are some aspects that are not so nice and so smart, but in general, it says to the political leaders that they must take religion into consideration. That actually means that there are some people defining themselves as religious leaders that ask to be heard in the public space and to restore, if not an influence or interference of religious sphere in public affairs, they want at least to be honored or at least to receive dignity and, if possible, dignity and sometimes money. And on the other side, you had research that is always using an ancient 17th century paradigm, that is the paradigm of unity, to follow and to look for things that unites us. And this is, as interreligious dialogue, as the first smile, is very important, very good, very nice, very smart, but from a theological point of view, is incapable to root the respect of the other in the core of your religion, not in the fact that we must oblige ourselves and the other one to adopt a third paradigm to respect each other, citizenships, human rights, or whatever, but to find a way to produce respect that is rooted in the theological experience, and something that is discarding violence, not because it is impolite, or it is no more accepted, or it is considered not receivable in the international sphere, but because it is conflicting with the very core of the different religions. This is the opposite of what Ascung was theorizing in the 90s. The idea that religions has a common ethos that they can share, that is made of a certain number of commandments that can be considered as the golden rule, common to everybody and possibly practiced by everybody. The problem is not to find a common denominator for religion, but the problem is how each religion may work on this. There is a famous sentence in a letter of Simone Weil saying that each religion is the only true. That is a paradox that say very strongly and very effectively that as in aesthetic experience, as in mystical experience, when you have a proper experience, you don't need to have many other ones. But the problem is how this can be combined in a peaceful society, not considering, as Immanuel Kant suggested, peace as a sort of instrument. From this point of view, there are some aspects that I wanted to underline that are part of what is my own research and research of my fellows at the foundation in Bologna. We have seen that there is an issue concerning the language. Religious illiteracy, that is ignorance of one own religion, one own tradition, and the tradition and the doctrines of the other. Religious illiteracy has produced a very strange and visible effect. I don't know if you perceive this like me, but I always find very odd when I listen that we call the terrorist and the people killing innocent lives radical. And when we call the wise person moderate. For instance, everybody who knows a bit Pope Francis will not say that at all that it is a moderate Christian. It is a very radical Christian. But radicalism in Christianity, as it is in many other religions, must and is coinciding with wisdom and spirituality. And on the contrary, moderation means exactly what the terrorists are doing, namely negotiating revelation and principles with political objectives and in general power. This issue of language is one of the most important one because it is one of the points coming close to 9/11, it is proper to remember it, is very visible when you think about what is called voluntary martyrdom. We have done a research in our journal Cristianesimo della Storia on the story of voluntary martyrdom, starting with Samson in the Bible and going with a very complicated path to Tamil guerrilla, Palestinian terrorism, Japanese terrorism, not necessarily Second World War, coming into the First World War, the theory. Father Gemelli, the founder of the Catholic University, wrote a book of military psychology on that, and entering with a devastating power into the Islamic Salafism and radicalism. And so this issue of language is one of the things that we have to work about, because we can do two things in the short time that is human life. Namely, the first one is to think and to practice the fact that repeating the first mile 1 billion times, we will have good effects sometimes. We will have good results. Or try to think what is and where is the second mile of interreligious dialogue, and how religious climate change can be managed and reduced through proper measures, trying to reduce the pollution of hate and ignorance of one of the other. This is I don't know if I frame something, but this is where I frame my own ideas and research, Catherine.
You have laid out many challenges, starting perhaps with the kisses and candles, with the challenges that come with religious illiteracy, starting with one's own tradition, but others, and the notion, I think, of the next mile. And I think that takes us to the Interfaith Forum for the G20, which to my mind is a very ambitious objective of, in quite explicitly through the recognition of this interfaith initiative, of bringing the religious ideas and practices and even debates into the global governance, which is reflected by the G20 itself as an important global institution in which people place much hope. So perhaps you could outline what would be your ideals? What would be a third mile that we might travel, looking at the event that will take place in Bologna, September 12 to 14?
Well, the Bologna Interfaith Forum has a visible character that is not relying on religious authorities only, but is putting under the same tent and under the same questions political leaders. The president of the G20 and Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, will close the forum, and the president of the European Semester, Borut Pahor, president of the Republic of Slovenia, will open it with David Sassoli, the president of the European Parliament, to put around under the same tent the political leaders, the religious authorities on the other side, and in a third leg, so to say, the people of any type of research, economic research, theological research, legal studies, and so on. Because what we think is that each one alone can only simulate and pretend to have a dialogue, but they are simply asking for something. From political side, the idea that religious experience and religious community are useful and to be respected only if and when, or only because they are capable to produce low-cost services. They go for free for helping the need. They go for free or almost free, bringing food to the people, vaccinating against HIV, demanding universality of vaccination in the COVID crisis, and so on. So on the political side, we have the sense that there is a common sense saying why to fight religious experience when we can buy religious leaders for just a few pennies. On the other side, you have religious leaders that are willing to compete in the market of dialogue, because to enter in the market of dialogue means to be more visible in your own community. Who cares about God? Who cares about revelation? The problem is how I can be more visible of the other one. And of course, I know enough, because I have them, the sins of the intellectuals and the scholars. They like when things does not work because there's something to teach and to preach. And so if we are capable to put these three type of attitudes under the same tent, we can hope to reduce a bit and to open a dialogue that could be a real dialogue, trying to get and to ask the best from each one. In practice, this could mean for us to understand that interreligious dialogue and interfaith dialogue is prepared by infra-religious dialogue and infra-confessional dialogue. In Bologna, we'll put a great emphasis on the role of ecumenism. The dialogue between churches for the search for a visible Christian unity, that is not a joke or the presumption of a Christian leadership or primacy somewhere, but it is an experience in which the Christian churches that in Europe, with the wars of religion, have killed in percentage much more people than the two world wars together, were capable to stop crime, not because they became less Christian, but because they became more Christian. This is a path that is now very open for the Islamic community and faith, and for all the other communities in this point. And we can also hope to have, through this model of dialogue, and the idea that we have, the model of that is looking for a dialogue, that we have the chance to learn how to differ and how to have a dissent. Religious freedom is the most interesting point in this. It's very evident that we cannot reach an agreement of what religious freedom is. For many countries, religious freedom is tolerance. And in Europe, we have countries in which they think that a national religious identity must be protected by the law. But what we have to learn is how to come to an agreement of differences without coping with the evil. And this is a point that, in my view, deserves much more than the 3 days that we will devote to this. And it asks also for some spiritual aspect. One of the events that I'm most interested in our forum is a ceremony that we'll perform after the end of Shabbat on September 11, that is a common memory of people killed in the places of prayer. Because to remember the people killed in synagogue, temple, mosque, churches, and so on, everywhere, by everybody, means to remember that we are all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, but we are mostly all brothers of Cain and Abel. And so we have the only way to get out from the voice of blood crying toward the God, using the most sincere and spiritual compassion, and taking on our shoulder the heavy burden of the suffering that have been inflicted to the other ones.
I alluded, and you also have alluded to a challenge that this interreligious forum has confronted since it was created in 2014, which is to have an official status within the G20 process. And you have taken us a number of miles along that road. You have also the B20, the business, the think tanks, the women. And interestingly, not official yet, there is also the Vision 20, but also another V20 is the Vulnerables 20, which are some of the communities that are not at the table in Bologna. So we have a couple of questions already, one from Aza Karam, one from Pierce Corden, which put to you, and also I presume to me, the question of the G20 in relation to the United Nations and the various mechanisms that are being developed within the United Nations systems to bring these same voices. Now, I have heard you comment on a number of occasions that what the Bologna IF20, ironically sometimes called the IF20, is not for sermons, but it is, I presume, also about ethics. And how do you see that? And if you'd like to plunge into the United Nations questions, we could take that.
Let me see the United Nations question because, oh yes. Well, so in what I hope is nothing more and nothing less than that. What I hope from the IF20 is to overcome, to a certain extent, what you, Catherine, were mentioning, speaking of the V20, the vulnerable ones. During the ministerial meeting of the Minister of Culture, the Minister of Culture of Italy, Dario Franceschini, remembered very proudly that the G20 is the 80% of the GDP of the world. And somebody told that there are very important observers from the religious leaders very close to the Colosseum in this moment, saying that this is exactly the problem, not the solution. The problem is that the few ones having too much, or as President Prodi, for President of the European Commission, that will chair one of the sessions at IF20 is also remembering, you can put into a bus more than the half of the income of humanity. And this is the problem. And so G20 was created in order to respond to the economic crisis, but is still doubtful and hesitating at the level of summit to enter into the question of the reasons of the crisis. Not simply the cyclical economic monetary reasons, but the more profound reasons. And to a certain extent, even what we call in Europe the Green Deal, the idea of a new growth made of sustainable economy, can be considered a way of restoring the distance between the powerful one, who has even the power to be good and sustainable, and the voiceless one, who cannot even take 3 years of the pollution that the developed countries have produced for 2 centuries to create better conditions in their own areas. And so the challenge is to restore, if I may say that, to restore a very pragmatic idea of principles. I'm a reader of The Tyranny of Value of Carl Schmitt, and so I'm very prudent in using the wording of values. But I like the wording of principles, that is a Roman law language. And in terms of principle, I think that it is very proper and very easy to say that everybody can root in its religious or non-religious tradition, in his profound belief, being it religious or not, an attitude of responsibility in front of the other ones. The responsibility, the first one, to respect the life of the other, to not to kill each other. The responsibility in front of the suffering of the other, asking to themselves the most courageous commitment to succor and help those who are in need. And the third one is forgiveness, because you cannot have a real stability, even at the national level, if you don't enter into a realm in which not only oblivion, but also forgiveness can create a new start. And this, in my view, are challenges that the most important leaders cannot hide them to themselves in the summit and around the summit, because these are the reasons of that. If I got correctly the question of Father Karam, that I want to thank for coming and for the question. The level of the interfaith forum is not at all, in my view, or at least as we have experienced it in this Bologna event, a competitor of other levels, in which nation multilateral traditions or diplomatic skills are involved, both Religion for Peace, the Lands of Civilization, the Refugees, the Human Rights Office in Geneva are involved in this, because I think that from the point of view of the EU20 is a way to bring to the summit the voice of those who are both in the 20 and outside the 20, because if there is a common character of religious experience at the global level, is that each believer has brothers and sisters in the 20 and outside the 20, which the ones in the 20 are usually much more fortunate in terms of expectations and life. The other brothers and sisters are less fortunate, but the responsibility that could be taken into the framework of religious experience is involving all of them.
I like your notion of focusing on principles as opposed to the language of values and of ethics, but to pursue this discussion of really what are we talking about with global governance. Many people feel that's an oxymoron, that we're very far from having any real sense of global governance, but the G20, the G7, the United Nations, regional organizations are all part of it. But there is something approaching a global agenda, which is articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are, of course, 17 goals, 169 targets, and an infinite number of indicators and principles, I would also say, that underpin it. But because that's so unmanageable, people have summarized them as 5 Ps. So people, peace, planet, prosperity, and partnership. And it's quite interesting that each of the hosts of the G20 in the past years have highlighted 3. So for Italy, it is people, planet, and prosperity, and thus echoing the SDGs and its huge agenda for common action. So I'm curious, the theme of healing, I think, which is the theme of the Bologna Forum, obviously confronts us with the issues facing the COVID crisis, very practical matters of religious roles in vaccination and in responding to misinformation, but also what is not on the Italian agenda, but is on yours and ours, which is peace. So I'm interested in any reflections you have on the religious roles in this huge, to a large extent, consensus global agenda.
Well, in my view, one of the results of the IF20 is to ask the summit to restore the fourth P, that is the P of peace. The title that we use for the forum is very tricky because it takes a verse of Qoheleth that says there is a time to heal, but Qoheleth does not say that there is a time for COVID and a time to heal. It says that there is a time to kill and a time to heal. And so when we stop the time to kill, we enter in an healing that is not simply the healing from the pandemic and so on, but is mostly the healing, as Cardinal Zuppi says, from the pandemic of war. This for me is very speaking because, as maybe all of you are aware of, both in the Jewish daily prayer and in the Latin litany, there is a verse saying, asking God to deliver us from pestilence, from famine, and from war. Because these three disasters are usually going together and they never suffer of solitude. And so what we are experiencing from COVID is impressive. Pope Francis is not the only one, but he has many times remembered that during the time of COVID, the people dying from keratosis in the world is much greater than the people died of COVID. And so if the summit was to be of a summit of leaders and not of followers, of an agenda of the popular emotions, this needs to be dedicated to a way to heal the three pandemics of wars, of hunger, and of pestilence, and what can be possible on war is the most important one. I'd like also to submit to the audience here, as we have done, as I've done in other circumstances in different places, a synthesis that I call the Parva Carta, the small charter in opposition to the Magna Carta of the British history. The Parva Carta is as large as a yellow post-it with 3 lines. We shall not kill each other, we shall help each other, and we shall forgive each other. That, in my view, like the 3 baskets of the Helsinki Conference on security and cooperation in Europe in the 70s, can collect different efforts and creating in the market of dialogue a more transparent attitude and a more cooperative attitude.
Underpinning much of this discussion, and one that takes you into the interreligious dialogue, are some questions about the, I guess, the common framework that you described, the principles, and the principles which are so central to the United Nations, which is human rights. So I'm interested in how you think any of those issues might come out. In a very practical sense, some of them do relate to the minorities and inequalities, or the majority that represents women. But I'm interested if you have any short reflections, given the short time that we have for this discussion, about some of the theological links to the human rights principles.
Well, I'm in the 80s. I was a student at Cornell University and a student of Brian Tierney, who was the one who discovered that human rights were starting from medieval reflections, and medieval glossators who were commenting on canon law discovering that there is something that is going beyond any sense of a connection between, so to say, truth and rights. And this, for me, is very speaking even now, because I'm persuaded that, of course, the work of Brian Taylor, who died last year, the work of Brian did not change the perception of the Christian churches concerning human rights. Some of them considers this still in the way of creation question first, as a product and a legitimate son of the church, as a mother, as a danger to be repelled. And the same is true with many other religious tradition and community. But the problem is that the dignity of the person and the dignity of diversity that can be enforced working in a much more serious theology. One thing that is striking me as historian is that if you take the Catholic theology of the 50s and the 60s, you have a dozen of theologians that were usually persecuted by the church. The doctoral thesis of Joseph Ratzinger was never published, but they were capable to deal with the big issues in a proper language, without shortcut of propaganda. The thesis of Ratzinger was that of the sense of history in the medieval theology. And what is, to my sense, very strange today is that the logical debate is not so developed. I'm wondering, we opened a new library of our foundation in Palermo on the Eastern doctrines of Islam, that is now one of the largest in Europe, exactly for this reason. I'm persuaded that illiteracy and ignorance are covering treasury that could be capable to move and to shake the common sense, saying that human rights are opposed to, and that are fostering the idea that the worst believer is the only sincere one. This is very evident if you take in this moment Islam and Taliban, with different degree of hypocrisy. Many things that the Taliban are the worst one, but they are expressing in the most sincere way something that is intrinsic to Islam, that it is false at all. It's not true at all, and we have to fight this and to show the other issues, and this is true for everybody. One of my favorite quotes on this is to suggest people to read the articles of Fernanda Alfieri on gay marriage in the Catholic Church in the 15th century. And so you can Google her, Alfieri, like the famous author, and Fernanda is the most Spanish name.
There were hopes, I'm sure there still are hopes in many quarters that the serious conflicts and deaths from violence in conflict are declining, and that we're looking potentially at a period of true peace, or at least an absence of conflict. But the shadow of what is happening in the world will inevitably fall over the meeting in Bologna, with, I think, the Ethiopia, which is not far away, obviously Afghanistan, some of the horrible tensions in Haiti, in Mozambique, in Myanmar, and in so many other parts of the world. How do you see this in the G20 agenda, but also in the IF20? And how far do you see this as linked to the global crisis of COVID? Or do you see it as much more the root causes that you were referring to before?
Well, what is the different situation that you mentioned are very different in their origin, in their internal grammar, political grammar, and theological grammar. There is something that is scaring, if you consider it its essence, the war in Tigray. is made with horrible means and very horrifying systems and practices, but the idea to destroy in advance communication infrastructure is making this invisible. And for this reason, nobody remembers of Tigray, and there is not even a plane to try to catch to escape from there. Or you have a situation like Mozambique, in which Salafism is offering to social rebellion a way to become vocal, and in which the reasons are made in a different way. What I think is that the role of communities, the religious communities, is first of all to be a religious community and to remember, to not leave invisible or voiceless the suffering of the other ones. This maybe it is not effective in the short term. It is not a very practical solution to be implemented in a few moments, but is a way to teach and to educate conscience to be open. And the building and the care and the cultivated conscience is necessary for reducing war, starting sincere negotiation and offering an opportunity of peace for more people. And the other is to endorse multilateralism. Because what we have seen in the past years is that to solve everything, it's enough to be 7, it's enough to be 3, it's enough to be me, indeed. And it is not true at all. To be alone is not enough. To be 7 is not enough. To be 20 is not enough, and not even to be everybody is not enough, because it demands a capacity to look to the next generations without this stupid idea that is used many times in political language, when you know why. Some people have to do something, you say, do it for your sons and daughters. Do it for yourself and for your conscience, if you have one. And I think that in this events and moments like the EVE 20 may offer an opportunity, and the way in which you're trying to make room to scholars in the Bologna EVE 20, that is of course very natural for a city like Bologna, is a way to open inside the world of the realm of dialogue, a proper role for those who can bring new ideas, a new legal solution, a new memory of history, and a new approach to that.
2 words that come out constantly in the, shall we say, the secular vocabulary around global governance are accountability and inclusion. And I think you're alluding, in a sense, to both of those as one of the underlying challenges that we face.
No.
Do you want to comment on that?
No.
No, I was going to turn to one of the questions, but maybe we can come back to it, because I wrestle with these 2 concepts constantly as to how to translate a principle into practice. But Victor Morales has put a question to you that picks up on religious radicalism. And he asks you, would you agree that the term fundamentalism is mistaken, since it ignores a deep faith conviction, say Jesus is the only way, truth, and life? How can we then go beyond the candles and kisses while retaining the depth of our convictions, while working together toward the solution of common problems?
Well, the issue of wording, from my point of view, is very important. And as I try to notice, the language that is considered as common and tolerable is always disappointing if you enter it, because to call violent extremism as something that looks as a sort of too clean wording to be true, for many people using violence and killing the other ones, they are subjectively persuaded to be true interpreter of the faith, and is this that must be analyzed and destroyed as soon as possible. If you use, for instance, a very Christian word, Christian Catholic word of integrism, it is not exactly true, because integrism is something else, is placed in a specific moment of history. If you use fundamentalism, you're adopting another type of confessional language that is not at all satisfying. The problem, in my view, is not how profound is the persuasion concerning the truth of one's own religion, but it is the result of this persuasion. Because the same persuasion can come and produce compassion or produce violence. If you compare religious belief to a material, religion is like iron. You can make spoon and you can make sword. And this sense of responsibility that is at the same time individual and collective responsibility is one of the points that, in my view, must be discussed. Not trying to not interrupt a research for a better language, and trying to reduce the confidence in approximate and superficial language.
Interestingly, when looking at the descriptions of events in Bologna, I stumbled quite often on the word integrism, because it's not a word that's used in English. So the question was, what was the equivalent? And the best we were able to do is fundamentalism. But again, that's not very satisfactory either. So I think we need to try to find a new language for this. One of the questions I think that you touched on and that we are exploring here is the question of religious literacy. And if you go back to your theological, intellectual roots, do you see paths forward for dealing with, I think we could say, the religious literacy, which is enough understanding to have an intelligent discussion about the complex roles of religion, but also one could also talk about governance literacy, not to speak of economic literacy, which is a long-standing problem. But in the final minutes that we have, perhaps you could go back to some of these fundamental principles and give us some ideas on how, at the Berkeley Center, in our strategic look at both religious roles in governance, but also the interreligious facets of it, what might be some of the paths forward?
Well, Francesca Deddu and I produced a research on religious literacy in Italy, and then a volume on religious literacy in Europe. And one of the things that we have learned is that the idea that religious literacy is something easy is even more dangerous than religious literacy. Because religious literacy does not mean to take kids and to tell them, listen, this is Magen David, this is a cross, this is to teach to them an alphabet in its diversity, saying, come on, boy, as you see, the letters are many, 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 and much more that you can imagine. The problem is how the letters can become words, and how the words can become a phrase, and how phrase can become a poem. And so in order to have some result on that, the only solution is to have the patience of creating research and conscience. We in Europe have established this year a research infrastructure on religious studies. And what I said to the evaluators to persuade them was this: not one of the problem of the next 5 years will be solved through the establishment of a research infrastructure of religious studies, but not one of the problem of the late 50s will be solved without a religious infrastructure of religious studies, a research of religious studies now. And so the patience of research is something that is bringing you result from a point of view of serendipity that we have seen in vaccination. For instance, the story of RNA messenger in vaccination is a tale, not a scientific article. And this means that when you hope to have result from science, from whatever science, you have to have the patience to create specialism, to create knowledge, to create experts, and to create the capability of doing this. The idea that you keep around the table one rabbi, one mufti, one imam, one pastor, two bishops, one cardinal, and a metropolitan bishop, two Buddhists, one Hindu wise person, and something else. In Europe, also Freemason. And then you can sign a chart on whatever topic is totally false. What we have seen, for instance, in the ecumenical dialogue, is that the churches are capable to agree on very subtle theological arguments, but when we come to gay marriage, they disagree. And so the sense is that is much more complicated, the path is much more long, the way to come to a better understanding that needs at the same time a good degree of utopia and a good degree of realism, a realistic utopia and utopian realism.
I like that, the realistic utopia. By the way, I do want to pick up a comment from Aza Karam that it may be helpful to note that there is a global charter of forgiveness that was developed by religious leaders themselves from across the different religious traditions. But as we approach the end, I want to go back to one of your many provocative but also important questions, which I think turns around the term moderate as opposed to extremist. It is a very unsatisfactory notion, and Madeleine Albright has made the wonderful comment, I think, that she's looking for passionately moderate people, people who have deep convictions, but who I think can see the different sides of an issue. But in the 2 minutes that's left, and if you have any comments on that, it would be inspiring.
Moderate is a virtue of government in Montesquieu, not a virtue of citizen. The government must be moderate. People is not asked to be moderate. People is asked to be wise. And moderation for individual is usually, it comes common in the journalistic language in the US, after the First World War for alcoholism. And so moderation is for things that are dangerous, that can threaten your health. I think that all the religious tradition have much better languages, the language of wisdom, the language of compassion, the language of love, that could be say much better what we are expecting and what we are looking, not simply from the religious leaders that are not so much leading many times, but from the religious community, from the faithful, from the people that are living in very different situation with very different mix and exposure of themselves to otherness and to the other one. But I'm pessimistic enough to think that we will never be delivered by the language of radical and moderate. And so it is important to say this, to remember this in the case that the Almighty will recreate the world, and to be careful in giving some words to the human beings.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of the time, and I deeply appreciate your ideas, your challenges, and your wisdom, and look forward to seeing you in Bologna in a week. Thank you to the audience. There are a number of very interesting questions that have been raised, and I think this is a suitable model and a suitable launch for the Berkeley Center Reflection, which will go on through this academic year. And we will continue the discussion over the next months. So again, thank you very much. And thank you to all who've joined. This, as I repeat, this will be posted on the website, and there we'll be summarizing and trying to draw the key elements from the discussion. So thank you and good evening, good night to all of you.